Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our host, the Archbishop of Perth, Tim Costelloe.
Well, what a beginning to our Australian Catholic Youth Festival here in our fantastic city of Perth. Welcome everybody and thank you so much for coming and joining us. We've had a great start this morning and I'm really excited to be here as the Archbishop of Perth, as the Archbishop of the host city, surrounded by nearly 2,000 young people from across Perth and WA and another 3,000 or 3,500 from all around the country. It's just so fantastic to see you all here. My job as the Archbishop here is simply to say a few words, maybe to help us enter into the theme of the festival for this year. Listen to what the Spirit is saying. As many of you know, that's the theme of the plenary council that we're holding here in Australia. It's already underway in a sense, but it has a formal meeting in October next year and another one in June or July of the following year. And the whole point of it is that we listen to what the Spirit is saying to us here in the church in Australia so that we can move forward into the future God wants for us. And I think all of us want that for each other and all of us want that for the church. So it's very exciting and I really want to encourage you because one of the reasons why we're having the Youth Festival now and one of the reasons why we're having it here in Perth is that we wanted to give the young Catholics of Australia a chance to share what you believe God might be asking of you, of all of us, as we move from now into the plenary council and beyond into the future for the church. So I wanted to just share a couple of simple thoughts with you, maybe to get your minds ticking over about what it might mean to listen to what the Spirit might be saying to you in your lives. A long time ago, in a country a long way from Australia, a young man, probably in his early or mid-20s, came home from fighting in a local war against a neighbouring kingdom. This was after he'd been released from captivity because he was taken prisoner during this war. And that experience absolutely changed this young man. Before he went to war, he was a typical fun-loving young person who's seen to live primarily for parties, for reckless adventure, and generally for having a good time. Probably sounds familiar to lots of us. But after the war, he closed in on himself. He became a bit moody and withdrawn, and he spent long hours on his own. Living as he did in a religious culture, he was surrounded by symbols of the Catholic faith. The countryside around him was peppered with roadside shrines, many little country churches. Some of them are actually starting to fall into disrepair. And one day, this young man entered one of these tumble-down churches and discovered that there was a red lamp burning in front of a crucifix hanging on the back of the church wall. The young man knelt down to say a prayer, and then it seemed to him that a voice was speaking from the figure of Christ hanging on that cross. And this is what the young man heard. Go and rebuild my church because it's falling into ruin. The young man looked around him at the crumbling walls and the half-ruined roof, and he realized that here in this humble little place, he could find a reason to live again, a reason to hope again. So he decided that he would do exactly what he heard the voice saying to him. He decided that he was going to rebuild this humble little church and restore it to its original dignity and its simple beauty. You've probably guessed by now that the young man's name was Francis of Assisi. And the church that the Lord was calling him to rebuild wasn't so much that tiny little building dedicated to St. Damien in the countryside outside the town of Assisi. Rather, the voice was asking him to rebuild the church, the Lord's church, which at that way in history seemed to have lost its heart, lost its way, and it needed to rediscover those things. You all know I'm not telling you anything that you don't know already, and that is that as we gather here in Perth for this Australian Catholic Youth Festival, the church, our church, which is actually not ours at all, but the Lord's church, seems to be in a bit of trouble. The terrible scourge of sexual abuse of the young has caused so much suffering to so many people. And what it's also done, is call into question the very legitimacy of the church, and especially the legitimacy of its leaders. The number of people identifying as Catholics who regularly go to Mass on Sundays or make use of the sacraments continues to drop more and more each year. Across the country, including here in WA, values which we as Catholics have always held close to our hearts, these values are being challenged by a society which doesn't seem any longer to want to hang on to its Christian foundations. And while our material prosperity, at least at this stage, continues to increase for many of us, so does the level of violence in our cities and our towns. So does the rate of suicide, including among young people. So does the experience of mental health challenges, the prevalence of drug abuse. These are all things that we know and encounter very often in our daily lives. I know this can sound a bit bleak, and we could easily give in to a sense of hopelessness and a sense of despair. Like that young man coming back from war, Francis of Assisi, we too could close in on ourselves. We could become moody and withdrawn. We could isolate ourselves from others. Or we could, in the earlier version of that young man, throw ourselves into a hectic life of endless parties and constant distractions, which is really a kind of a deliberate turning away from all the challenges around us. But if, like that young man Francis, we give ourselves a chance to tune into another wavelength, we too, maybe in a different way, but we too might hear a mysterious, unexpected, possibly quiet and hard to catch, but nonetheless persistent voice calling to us, holding out to us a chance and a challenge, not to sink into a sense of hopelessness, not to sink into a life of frivolous distraction. What we might hear that voice whispering to us is that, much as Pope Francis said to young people at World Youth Day in Poland a few years ago, get off your couch, set out on some new and uncharted pathways. Those words of Pope Francis, I think, were the modern Francis putting into contemporary language the words the other Francis heard so long ago. We could put them together, and if we did, it would sound something like this. Get up off your couches. Go out and help rebuild my church. Help it to set out on new and uncharted pathways. Help stop the church, my church, from falling into ruin. In that address the Pope gave in Poland, he went on to say this. And again, maybe the Lord, pardon me, is calling us here at the Youth Festival through the words of Pope Francis this morning. Today's world demands that you, and he was talking to young people, today's world demands that you be a protagonist of history. The Lord wants to work one of the greatest miracles we can experience. He wants to turn your hands, turn your hearts into signs of reconciliation, of communion, and of creation. So, young people, said Pope Francis, have the courage to teach the rest of us that it is easier to build bridges than it is to build walls. Francis of Assisi knew that the Lord was calling him to rebuild the church, not to tear it down and create a new one. And the Lord will be asking us, asking you to do exactly the same thing. Francis did it by letting go of the things that didn't really matter so that he could be free, with the help of the Lord's grace, to concentrate on the things that do really matter. And it will be the same for us. Over the next few days, you're going to hear a lot about the Plenary Council. If you do, if you manage to tune in to the Lord over these days and then share what you're hearing with us, the bishops are all here, share what you're hearing in your hearts with us as bishops, and help us to understand what the Lord might be asking of us as we all move together into the future. So again, to use the words of Pope Francis, don't be afraid to make some noise. Don't be afraid of causing a bit of a mess. Don't be afraid of sharing what is in your hearts with the rest of the church. That's why we're here. That's why we want to listen to each other. But I want to advise you to remember this, something really important. Francis of Assisi made more noise by what he did than by what he just said. And Pope Francis, though of course he speaks to us very often, also makes more noise, makes a greater impact by what he does than simply by what he says. Go and rebuild my church, the Lord is saying to you over these days together. Some in the church have lost their way, lost their heart, lost their hope. So be young people of the way of Jesus. Be young people of heart and of hope in the Lord's church. Every single one of you is very welcome here in our beautiful city of Perth. Welcome here at the Australian Catholic Youth Festival. You're welcome here with your questions, with your hopes, with your dreams. You're welcome here with your doubts and with your fears. You're welcome here with your hesitations, and you're welcome here with all your enthusiasm. God is real. Christ is alive. The church of which you are a part is yearning to help you and to hear you, to teach you and to learn from you, to challenge you and to be challenged by you. So I hope you have a wonderful time, an exciting time, a really enriching time. But most of all, I hope that in whatever ways God tries to speak to you in your own heart and in your own life, you are ready to listen, you're ready to meet Christ, and you're ready to let yourself be captured by him. So that's it. We've started the Youth Festival. We've bounced the ball. Now, I know you're all wondering why I've got this. We've bounced the ball. Now it's time for me to handball the whole thing to you guys. So, whoever the lucky person is, I don't know who it's going to be. Hands up everywhere. So, let me just finish by saying, let's go out and together Let's kick as many goals for Jesus and for the church as we possibly can.